helping to design and implement controls to mitigate the risk of fraud, developing training and communications for employees to help them recognize and prevent fraud. And she spends a lot of time researching fraud to help the DOT stay ahead of and proactive in a very changing environment. So with that, please welcome Darlene Miller.
Thank you, Shannon. Appreciate that. So today we're going to learn about infrastructure fraud. So what exactly is infrastructure fraud? Let's start by breaking it down. So infrastructure is the basic physical and organization structures and facilities that are needed for the operation of society and any enterprises. So that can be bridges, roads, power supplies, any of those things are your infrastructure. Oops, sorry, I missed one. Okay, so what's fraud? Fraud is any activity that relies on deception in order to achieve a gain. Fraud becomes a crime when it is knowing misrepresentation of truth or concealment of a material fact that causes another to act to his or her detriment. And you can look at, for this, you can look at like Enron, because they fix their books to make themselves look better. So financially, they didn't steal any money, but they made it so that customers or shareholders lost. And also when deception is used to deceive a person or organization of money. So what's infrastructure fraud? It basically refers to any fraudulent activity that occurs in the context of infrastructure projects. Infrastructure fraud can have serious consequences, including cost, project delays, and compromised safety. So it isn't always about the money. And this type of fraud can also relate to purchasing or equipment and supplies. So what do you need to know? Sherman Antitrust Act was passed in 1890, and so I'm going to read this. I tried to memorize it, but the wording is from the 1890s. So the Sherman Antitrust Act states that every person who shall monopolize or attempt to monopolize or combine and conspire with any other person or persons to monopolize any part of the trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations shall be deemed guilty of a felony. So what does this mean? Let's kind of break it down to make it a little easier. It actually prohibits competitors from entering into any agreement to restrain trade or interstate commerce, including price fixing, bid rigging, and bid rotation schemes. It does not allow anti-competitive agreements or unilateral conduct that monopolizes or attempts to monopolize relevant market. So the main goal is to promote competition and help smaller businesses get a fair chance. According to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, construction fraud is ranked as the fourth most costly fraud in medium loss. In 2022, 78 cases of construction fraud were reported at a median cost of $203,000 apiece. That totaled more than $15 million. Now, mind you, these are only reported cases. Some places will not report fraud basically because of the cost or reputation to their company. So let's look at some basic types of infrastructure fraud schemes. We have bid rigging, price fixing, customer and market allocation, and collusion. And all of these are illegal under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Bid rigging is the most used form of fraud, so we'll spend a little bit more time on that. So this happens during the bidding phase, and it's an agreement among competitors as to who will be the winning bidder. It starts when the purchaser solicits for a bid, and it happens when the bidders agree in advance who is submitting the winning bid. The purchaser depends on the competition between bidders to generate the lowest bid, but instead the purchaser is getting a bid that is higher than the competitive market. Some types of bid rigging is bid suppression, complementary bidding, and bid rotation. Let's look at bid suppression first. Right there, this is one where the competitors agree not to bid or withdraw a bid that they previously submitted. Complementary bidding, this is when a person is picked to win the bid and the other ones will submit a bid that do not meet requirements or are more costly. And the last one is bid rotation. All conspirators submit bids, but by agreement take turns being the low bidder on a series of contracts. And this can involve that the losing bidders may receive subcontracts from the winner of the bids. Now let's look at some indicators that you might need to recognize if there is bid rigging going on. Number one is identical bids from different companies, either as individual line items or lump sum bids. Bids submitted way above the agency's estimate or way above comparable bids by the same types. Winning bidders subcontract part of the project to one or more losing bidders. An indication that there may be some physical alteration of bids at the last minute. Our particular line items for some bidders are much higher than for others. Now, before we look at some more bids, indicators, I want to make sure you realize that just because you see an indicator, do not actually assume that it's fraud. Check into it further because it may not be fraud at all. So be very cautious on that point. Some more indicators. The range of bids show a clear gap between the winner and all others. The bids of all companies are very close. The same increment between the bids of several companies, and companies submit high bids when work is known to be scarce. A company gives different bids for the same line item and different contracts for those close in time. Physical evidence of collusion, such as different companies submitting bids with the same handwriting in the same envelope or with the same mathematical or spelling errors, or maybe from the same fax number. And qualified bidders do not bid, especially if they initially took steps to bid. Some more indicators. A contract is rebid because the initial bids are unacceptable. The bids come back in the same order, or some bidders fail to rebid. Significant increases by most bids over previous prices when there have been no substantial cost increases. And prices mysteriously drop when a new bidder appears on the scene. And last, competitors are seen meeting shortly before or after the bids are submitted. Am I behind? Oh. Okay. Now there you know what some indicators are. So what happens if you find that it might be bid rigging? So take action, verify that what you're seeing is actually bid rigging. Review your procurement records to see if there are more indicators. Ask questions. Notify management and follow your department's internal procedures for reporting fraud. And also you can report it to the Antitrust Division in the U.S. Department of Justice. The next type of bid or infrastructure fraud is price fixing. This is basically when competitors agree to raise or fix prices they will charge for their goods or services. A minimum price is set and they will not bid below that price. Some indicators of that: look for situations where competitors always announce their price increases at the same time for the same amount, or have staggered price increases with the same pattern, such as appearing to take turns going first. Look for competitors reducing or eliminating discounts at about the same time, and be alert to situations in which all prices seem to be uniform and all suppliers refuse to negotiate their prices. Next, we're going to talk about customer and market allocation. This is an agreement between competitors where they will they will only compete for specific regions or customer type. So let's take North Dakota and divide it into West, Central, and East. What happens is competitors get together and they decide competitor A gets the western part and B and C will not compete in that market, and so on, it goes forward. Or they can pick customers and decide that they will only compete for these specific customers. So what are some indicators that you need to look for? Look for situations in which the same company seems to get your business over and over and the competitors never come around to solicit it. It can also be an indicator of internal fraud by employees. Other businesses refuse to submit a bid, or the bid is ridiculously high. And when a company that should want your business is not interested. And once again, I'm going to remind you that just because you see an indicator does not necessarily mean it's fraud. Do your homework and always check into it further. The next type is collusion. Collusion is a secret agreement or cooperation between at least two or more parties for an illegal or a deceitful purpose. Some conditions that are favorable for collusion is when there are few vendors, contractors, or bidders. The fewer the number, the easier it is for them to get together and agree on a price, bids, customers, or territories. Collusion risk can increase if a product can't be substituted or if there are strict specifications for the product. The more standardized a product is, the easier it is for competing firms to reach an agreement on common price structures. So let's look at some conditions that are favorable for collusion to happen. Repetitive purchases may increase the chance of collusion as the vendors become very familiar with other bidders and future contracts provide the opportunities for competitors to share the work. Collusion is more likely if the competitors know each other well, and bidders who congregate like in the same building or town to submit bids have an easy opportunity to meet at the last minute. So let's look at how we can detect infrastructure fraud. Once you've realized that this could be happening, there are steps you can take to remedy it, or you can take these beforehand to make sure that you're reducing your risk of fraud. It is a significant business risk, and attempts should be made to reduce that risk as much as possible. To do that, you have to build a comprehensive fraud detection and prevention program for your organization. That sounds like a mouthful, but it takes a bit, but you can do it. It's pretty. I found it easy, but yeah, it takes a while. So how do you build a comprehensive fraud detection and prevention program? It's going to take several steps, like I said, but it'll help reduce the risk of fraud in your organization, and that's what you want. The first one is build a profile of potential frauds. So what you want to do is you want to look at your organization and look at where fraud can be committed. Construction, finance, accounts payable, accounts receivable, procurement. And once you list those, let's just use construction for an example. You look at what can happen underneath construction, bid rigging, market or customer allocations, things like that. And what you want to do is you want to look at each of these risks and determine how dangerous is it? Is it on a scale of 1 to 5, where a 1 being the worst? Is it a 1? Can it happen real easy in your organization? Or is it 5? No, we got things in place. We got this, no problem. So once you get all your risks listed, you want to start testing. So let's look at just accounts payable, for example. If you have controls in place, you're going to look at who receives the invoices, who reviews the vendors, who approves the invoices, and who approves the payments. So what you want to do is look at, do you have segregation of duties? Does the same person do the same several items, like approve vendors, approve invoices, approve the payment? You have to kind of watch that. So test them and see where you're at. When you do the test, make sure you design it using indicators mentioned earlier. Testing can differ between organizations, so if you talk to another organization, they might not test the same way you do. It depends on your organization and how your structure is. And testing is not a one-size-fits-all. What may work for someone else may not work for you. And remember that once you start testing, if you find something, it's just a precursor to an actual investigation. You may not find anything, or you may find further evidence that you need to dig into it further. Next, you need to improve your controls by implementing continuous auditing and monitoring. And we're going to talk about internal controls in a little bit, give you a little more information on that. Once you have tested, you need to communicate the monitoring activity throughout the organization. You need to let everybody know what you're doing, how you're doing it, why you're changing things, because some people get in the rut, well, we've always done it that way. And I've heard that a lot. Well, we've always done it that way. Why do you want to change it? Because we want to avoid the risk of fraud as much as possible. Next thing is make sure your management knows what's going on. If you see something wrong and you don't include management, they're not going to have a clue what's going on. So keep them in the loop and let them know what's happening. Next, you need to fix any broken controls. If you see something that's not working or it can raise your risk, fix the controls. Know why look at why it's doing that and what you can do to fix it. If you don't strengthen your controls, you're going to end up having fraud happening. Like I said before, if you can initiate a transaction, approve it, and be the receiver of goods, you've got a problem going on. So the last step is expand the scope and repeat. A lot of people go, well, you've already been through this, why do you want to do it again? Because procedures change, your process may change, and your environment may change. You may get more people, you may get more business. Like I said, if you have someone doing the same thing or several things, you can easily have fraud happen. So you want to avoid that. Now let's look at internal controls. So why do we need internal controls? Because a good system of internal controls can greatly reduce an organization's vulnerability to fraud. It helps stop or eliminate fraud. But there's always a way to look around it, so you've got to be careful with that. And that's why you do step 7, you repeat and you look at it again. So what exactly are internal controls? They are basically a series of policies and procedures or technical protections that are in place to prevent problems and protect the assets of your organization. Let's look at the types of internal controls. There are 3 types of internal controls: preventative, detective, and corrective. The first one is preventative. These are actually manual or automated procedures that are in place to stop fraud before it happens. So you got segregation of duties, authorizations, or even physical security. The next is detective. Okay, these are manual or automated, and these actually will detect fraud after it has happened. So you want to do preventative more if you can. Try and get that in place first. Detective are like bank reconciliations, audits, and reviews. If you don't reconcile your bank account and someone is writing themselves checks, this fraud will continue until you actually reconcile your bank account or look at your general ledger. So be very cautious and do this stuff, and you can stop fraud before it gets too far, before you've lost too much money. Corrective, this is what you do after a fraud has happened or after you've noticed something that's not right. You want to enact controls or processes that will reduce or stop the fraud. Some of them are backups, record retention, recovery, disciplinary actions, policy and procedure changes. And also, if you're going to go in and change policies and procedures, make sure you train your employees on these. Don't just say, here you go, have at it. Let them know why you're doing this. one of the biggest issues that I've noticed, if you don't explain why you're changing something, you'll get a lot of resistance. So be cautious with that. And remember that no system of internal controls can completely eliminate the risk of fraud, but a well-defined and effective internal control system can help deter the average fraudster by reducing the opportunity to commit the fraud and increasing the detection of the fraud. So what else can you do to reduce the risk of infrastructure fraud? Expand your list of bidders to make it more difficult for bidders to collude. As the number of bidders increase, the probability of successful collusive bidding will decrease, and encourage all qualified bidders to bid. Bid packages should require that bidders sign and submit non-collusive affidavit stating the bidder has not colluded and informing bidders of the penalties both for violating the Sherman Act and signing a false non-collusive affidavit. And I've talked to people about this one, and they say, well, if they're going to commit fraud, they're going to sign it, whatever. But this will go against them if they do get caught, because the government will go after them and then punish them for that one too. Okay, ensure that all employees tied to procurement activities know the indicators of bid rigging, price fixing, and other types of collusion. If they have an idea what to look for, then they'll be able to pick it out if it is happening. So some more ideas how you can reduce the risk. Maintain all your procurement records. If it's happening or suspected, the records can be used to determine if it's actually happening. Ask questions. If prices or bids submitted don't make sense, pressure vendors to explain and justify their prices. Know and understand the dynamics of the market in which you make major purchases. Okay, I'm going to show you some examples of infrastructure fraud that has happened in the past. One of the biggest ones, I don't know if you've heard about it, the Central Artery Tunnel Project in Boston, Massachusetts. This is known as the Big Dig. If you go out on the internet, you can find tons of information on it, and you just read it and you go, wow. But the Big Dig is actually a series of bridges and tunnels to replace Boston's old central artery. It was conceived to help reduce the traffic and improve mobility in Massachusetts. It is one of the most expensive highway projects undertaken in the U.S. at the time, and was famously plagued with cost overruns, delays, leaks, and other host of problems. If you look at this chart, in 2007, when it was completed, the cost was $14.8 billion. Now, if you look one line down, the original estimate was only $2.56 billion. So it would cost 5 times more than the original estimate. And let's look at some of the reasons why. First one we're going to talk about is aggregate industries. They were one of the largest suppliers of asphalt and concrete in New England. They committed fraud when they falsified records to hide the poor quality of concrete delivered to the highway project. This is where they made more money, but they also compromised the safety of the citizens. And you can look at it this way. If you're driving down the highway, you want to make sure that highway is safe. If somebody is going to commit fraud and do cheaper concrete on there, if it breaks up, you could die, you could wreck your vehicle, your family could be hurt. So compromised safety is actually a huge item when it's fraud. Aggregate Industries had 6 current and former employees that were charged with making false statements, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit highway fraud. The general manager and the operation managers of Aggregate were found guilty of highway project fraud and related offenses for the participation in a scheme to provide concrete that did not meet contract specification and to conceal the true nature of the concrete through false documentations. The company, not the employees, the company was actually fined $50 million to resolve its criminal and civil liabilities in connection with fraudulent scheme to deliver poor quality concrete. The money they received was put into a fund and will be used for long-term maintenance of the tunnel. The next company that tried to get their money's worth out of the Big Dig is Modern Continental. They were paid more than $3 billion for the work they did on the Big Dig. They overbilled in a scheme and totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars. They lied about the quality of work on 2 areas of the Big Dig, including a section where a ceiling collapsed, killing a woman. And there you have the compromised safety. They may have come out with extra money, but a woman paid for her life on it. So, the company did file bankruptcy protection in 2008, the first business day after federal prosecutors charged the company with lying about its work on the project. The company pled guilty to making a false statement with respect to the construction of the slurry wall panel that ruptured, flooding the I-93 roadway. And they also pled guilty to making numerous false statements in connection with the billing of apprentice workers at journeyman rates on various Big Dig contracts. Now you're seeing why that costs so much more. Let's talk about Tishman Construction. Tishman Construction has been around since 1898 in New York City, and they actually worked on projects as the World Trade Centers, and no, their fraud did not cause them towers to collapse. So, first thing you think of. The Plaza Hotel renovations, the Javits Convention Center and expansion renovation, and the Aqueduct Casino. Tishman built several projects at higher than agreed upon rates, padded labor foreman's timesheets, and billed for days the workers were out sick or on vacation. And because of the intentional overbilling of $5 million, the company was fined $20 million for mail and wire fraud. And I've had someone ask me about how can they get wire fraud. You're thinking like kind of a telegraph or something. Wire fraud can be using your internet, your phone, any kind of electronic communication, and then get you for wire fraud. Tishman cooperated with investigation and have instituted safeguards as a result of the flawed company procedures and policies. This next one, I was actually able to visit with a former Wisconsin DOT employee that was involved in this, in finding this bid rigging scheme. And they actually, the fraud was discovered when one of the participants decided that they weren't getting their fair shake, and so they went to the FBI and reported the fraud. There were 4 executives that conspired by telephone and in-person meetings to rig bids and attempt to allocate projects among themselves. In their meetings, they shared bid information and discussed potential competition. The rigged bids were submitted electronically through interstate wire communications, hence the wire fraud. The fraud included over $100 million in construction projects, and a majority of the projects were federally funded. Sorry. So information of the fraud was gathered by tapping phones and recording a meeting at a restaurant. And this retired DOT employee that I visited with, he said they were actually out in the van in the parking lot listening to it, and they had a little device at the table. He thought it was kind of funny. If it wouldn't have been such a serious thing, he probably would have laughed harder at it. But he said it was kind of fascinating that they could actually listen to them doing this. And actually, he said the worst part was the lack of respect they showed, that they were getting away with it. So that was kind of hard, he said. So 4 high-level executives were convicted of bid rigging and wire fraud. So we want to stop fraud. How do you do it? Remember to build your comprehensive fraud detection and prevention program. Build a profile of potential fraud. Test the transactional data for possible indicators of fraud. Improve your controls by implementing continuous auditing and monitoring procedures. communicate the monitoring activities throughout the organization, provide management with immediate notification when things are going wrong, fix any broken controls immediately, expand your scope, and then repeat. So don't forget that a well-designed and implemented fraud detection prevention system can significantly reduce the chances of fraud occurring in your organization. With this well-designed fraud program, you can reduce your length and cost of fraud in your organization. Does anybody have any questions? It's kind of a lot of material, so I apologize for that. All right, thank you for coming. Appreciate that.